everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and braving that line of thunderstorms that's rolling in from the west. Hopefully I'll talk long enough that they'll be gone by the time we're done. So before I get started, how many of you have ever been to an event like this, specifically about lionfish, a lecture, a seminar, any sort of workshop regarding lionfish? Great. Have any of you ever seen me talk before? Only a couple. All right, great. So what I want to do with tonight's talk is I want to get you caught up on the most current science that's available on this lionfish invasion. Lionfish have sort of been a hot topic issue for the last few years, and if you look at trends in scientific literature, even as recently as a few years ago, there were very few scientific studies looking at lionfish, and then all of a sudden, in the last few years, they've exploded. So what I want to do with tonight's talk is obviously give a little bit of background, talk about how lionfish got here, look at why they're such effective invaders, look at what's being done to control them, are we able to control them? But most importantly, I want to get you up to date with all of the current science that's being done looking at this awful invasion. But before we get into lionfish, I want to step back and take a look at the big picture. And hopefully, you know, we're all pretty aware, I think, especially in this part of Florida, people use the ocean a lot. We have a lot of boaters and beachgoers and divers and fishermen. And I think it's pretty clear to most of you that our global fish stocks are collapsing. There's a number of fish taxa that are in decline all around the globe. And the two major primary causes for these declines in fish stocks are loss of natural habitats and overexploitation. So in the local setting, loss of habitats involves things like turning our beautiful mangrove forests into unnatural shoreline areas. And then obviously we have major harvest issues for important species, bluefin tuna, some of our invertebrates like stone crabs and lobsters. But what I'm not going to include in this list are invasive species. So actually, as of right now, compared to overexploitation and habitat loss, marine invasive species aren't having that big of an effect on fisheries as of yet. However, invasions are causing big problems all around the globe. And one thing I want to take a second to do is clear up some terminology. And I catch my colleagues abusing these terms quite a bit. I want to talk about the difference between an exotic species and an invasive species. So both of these are animals that are introduced, or plants, that are introduced to an area where they don't occur naturally. So an exotic animal is an animal that doesn't belong in a given area. However, it hasn't necessarily moved on to these next two steps. They don't necessarily begin to breed. And most importantly, an exotic organism doesn't spread rapidly and cause severe environmental harm. So as an example, I took this picture a few weeks ago right near my house down in Fort Lauderdale. Those are green vervet monkeys. They run around kind of by the Fort Lauderdale International Airport, and they've been here since the 1940s. They obviously don't belong here. They have established a small breeding population, but what they're not doing, they're not spreading, and they're not causing any environmental harm. They're staying in one confined area. Other examples of exotic species that aren't necessarily invasive, the little parrots that we see flying all over. Everybody notices we have green parrots flying around most of the southern part of Florida. They're exotic. They don't belong here. They are breeding, but they're not spreading rapidly, and nobody's really shown them to cause any severe environmental harm. Then, when we look at something like a 15-foot African rock python, that's where we move on to this invasive species theory. We have an animal that came from somewhere else, has started reproducing, and now is spreading rapidly and causing environmental harm. So it's important to note there are examples of exotic species that will never become invasive. They're going to stay exotic. They're just never going to proliferate enough to become invasive. And as sort of a little trivia point, there are a few examples of native organisms that are actually sometimes considered invasive. And my favorite is the cattail. Is everybody familiar with what a cattail is, the plants that grow out in the Everglades? So cattails are a native plant in Florida. They belong here. However, historically, their distribution is pretty limited to deeper edges of channels in the Everglades. Because we've changed the way that water flows into the Everglades, and because we've changed nutrient regimes coming from Big Sugar, south of Lake Okeechobee, this native organism has begun to act like an invader. It fits this criteria. It's spreading rapidly, and it's causing environmental harm. Cattails now cover thousands and thousands of acres in the Everglades in areas where they shouldn't be. So tonight's talk, we're going to focus on invasive organisms. And in marine systems, invasions are nothing new. In fact, there's a study looking at invasions in San Francisco Bay dating back to the 1870s. And in fact, as long as humans have been moving from place to place, we've probably been introducing marine organisms. However, the important point is that most documented marine and estuarine invasive organisms are little itty-bitty things. Very small mollusks and crabs, algae, grasses, things that are low on the food web. And when we think of harmful invasions, we typically think of predators. Predators are usually considered the most harmful type of invader. So for example, this brown tree snake was introduced to Guam after World War II, and within a relatively short period of time, it wiped out almost all of the native vertebrate animals in Guam. But there are very few examples right now of invasive marine predators until this guy showed up. So now all of a sudden we're dealing with a relatively novel idea of having an invasive marine organism that also is a relatively top predator. So lionfish are actually one of the very first examples ever of an invasive marine fish. There are very few examples, and in fact, it's the very first example of an invasive marine fish that is native to the Pacific and has become invasive in the Atlantic. And in a little bit of irony, a species that's native to Florida has actually gone the other direction. There's an invasive population of our beloved red drum, redfish, that have escaped from a hatchery in Taiwan, and that's sort of an interesting example of an Atlantic species that's become invasive in the Pacific. Lionfish are members of the scorpion fish family, and there are 26 different species of lionfish in the Pacific. We are only worried about 2 of them here in Florida. And in fact, the 2 species that we have in the Atlantic and the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico are so visually identical, you can only tell them apart by DNA. So for tonight's talk, I'm just going to refer to them as lionfish. But remember, out of the 26 species, we only have 2 that have been introduced into Florida's waters. It's also important to remember, though, as members of the scorpion fish family, lionfish are closely related to our native scorpion fish that many of you may see when you go diving or snorkeling locally. Why haven't our native scorpion fish become a problem when the invasive lionfish have? So that's something to think about as we go through tonight's talk. I mentioned lionfish are from the Pacific. They actually range as far west as the eastern coast of Africa and as far east as Japan, going down into some of the South Pacific islands. The 2 species we have, one is a little bit more prevalent at the western end of the range. Another is a little more prevalent along the eastern end of the range. And in the middle, they interbreed freely. And that's why they're so difficult to distinguish. They're sister species that are really closely related. How did they get here? Well, many of you may have heard different introduction stories, but there's really only one true answer. Lionfish were introduced inadvertently by well-meaning aquarium owners. Lionfish are an extremely popular pet fish. They're beautiful, they're charismatic. You can teach them to eat out of your hand, but they get big and they get aggressive. So what we think happened is people had pet lionfish that outgrew their tanks and maybe ate some of their expensive pet fish. And years ago, we didn't know any better. People released pets rather than killing them or selling them or taking them back to a pet store. So we think what happened is lionfish were probably released, one here, one there, maybe one over there, and over time, enough of these fish were released to start causing problems. The first official lionfish sighting occurred off of Dania Beach, Florida, which is down by Fort Lauderdale, in 1985. However, I have really reputable reports from a diver dating back to the 1950s that there were some lionfish spotted off of Government Cut in Miami. So in my mind, I think as long as lionfish were a popular saltwater aquarium fish, there were probably a few lionfish here and there being released. However, there are a number of other alternative introduction stories. Does anybody in the audience know of an alternative introduction story that maybe you've heard about in another presentation or read about or heard about on the news? Anyone? Yeah. Hurricane Andrew, right. So there's a story that lionfish were possibly in an aquarium on a dock during Hurricane Andrew, and the hurricane knocked the aquarium over, and now we have lionfish. So there's a problem with that. Hurricane Andrew occurred, 7 years after the first lionfish was sighted in Florida? The scientist that made that initial report has since retracted that story. So scratch Hurricane Andrew off. Has anybody heard any other possible? Yeah. Yeah, ships' bilges or ballast. Big cargo ships, these transatlantic and trans-Pacific cargo ships, fill their cargo holds or their ballast tanks up with water so they ride lower and have a smoother ride in transit. The problem there is most ships coming from the Pacific to the Atlantic have to go through the Panama Canal. And in order to get through the Panama Canal, you have to empty your ballast tanks on the Pacific side. So if the ballast water of large ships was a vector for lionfish, We would have a lot of lionfish on the Pacific side of the Panama Canal, and we don't. The other problem is very tiny lionfish that might get sucked up into a ship's tanks are fragile, and they probably wouldn't do well during the crossing. Okay, so another one is the Atlantis Hotel in Nassau. This is a popular story. Apparently, the Atlantis Hotel has a humongous lionfish display, and they have for a number of years. And people have accused Atlantis of allowing their lionfish to spawn in captivity, and the eggs got washed out, and that is what started this invasion. There's two problems. Number one, nobody has ever successfully bred lionfish in captivity. As hardy as they are in the wild, they're actually a pretty difficult fish to spawn in an aquaculture setting. So I doubt that it would ever happen accidentally. The other problem is a genetics study has actually looked at the spread of lionfish through the Caribbean basin and has documented a very strong founder effect here in Florida. So the genetics of lionfish throughout the Atlantic and the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico likely originated in an introduction here in South Florida. The last one, this one worries me a little bit. Some people have speculated that scuba diving tour operators have released lionfish and other non-native aquarium fish to beautify the reefs. If anyone in this room has been scuba diving for more than 30 years or so in Florida, you can pretty safely demonstrate how much damage our reefs have experienced over the years. Our reefs are a fraction of what they were years ago in terms of coral cover and fish abundance. So dive operators were rumored to have let fish go to give their clients something to look at. I don't think that was the case with lionfish, but as we approach the end of the talk, I'll show you some other fish that have shown up here unexpectedly that possibly may have gotten here by dive operators. So this is an animation. It starts in 1985 off the southeast coast of Florida. Notice there are no other lionfish sightings for a number of years. The next big cluster you're going to see is in 2000 and 2001, way up here in North Carolina. And actually, that's where the real population growth began. By 2004, the Bahamas become invaded. And now watch as the entire rest of the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico gets taken over. As of today, lionfish are found everywhere from North Carolina through the entire southeast coast of the US, the whole Gulf of Mexico, Central America, the northern coast of South America up to the mouth of the Orinoco River, and then all of the Caribbean islands. So one of the big things I want to talk about tonight is why lionfish have been so darn good as an invasive species. First of all, like I said before, they've been introduced numerous times. It wasn't just one fish tank flipping over during Hurricane Andrew. These fish were let go here and there in dribs and drabs. So what that has done is increase the genetic diversity a little bit and given us multiple opportunities for this invasion to spread. Number two, they reproduce really often. A mature lionfish can spawn every 4 days, and in the more tropical regions of the invaded range, they can spawn throughout the year. During each spawning event, an individual fish can release up to 30,000 eggs. So you can see they reproduce like crazy. Another factor, most marine organisms, whether we're talking about fishes or invertebrates like lobsters or crabs, when they hatch out of their egg, they don't turn into a little miniature version of the adult. If anyone here has ever had guppies in a fish tank, you know that baby guppies look just like big guppies, but they're little. Marine organisms don't do that. Instead, they have a life history stage, a larval life history stage, very much like a butterfly starting out as a caterpillar. If you didn't know better and I showed you a caterpillar, you wouldn't know that it turned into a butterfly. That's something that we've learned, but they don't look like each other. So most larval marine organisms don't really look or act like the adult version. So in the case of lionfish, they have a little minuscule larval phase that drifts in the ocean currents for over a month. Now we've got this little current we have off the shore here, the Gulf Stream, that rips along sometimes at 3+ miles per hour. If you're a lionfish larva drifting in that current passively, over that 1 month period, we're talking about thousands of miles, well over 1,000 miles of drift. So that's one of the ways that lionfish have so successfully spread to occupy the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. So these last couple points that are in yellow, these are the points that I want to focus on for tonight's talk. Lionfish are generalists. They're not picky, they're not fussy, they live in a lot of different types of habitats, they eat a lot of different types of food. Lionfish are unknown to our native organisms. Our native predators and our native prey are totally naive about lionfish. They don't recognize them. Lionfish grow extremely rapidly, really, really quick compared to most other reef fish species. They have venomous spines. I think everybody's familiar with the venom that lionfish have. And that's one trait that they possess that may have allowed them to become a very successful invader. And then finally, lionfish have a suite of really unusual behaviors that have allowed them to become successful. So starting with habitat, lionfish are found in an extremely, extremely wide range of habitats. They're obviously found in beautiful, pristine coral reefs. We found them here in estuaries, pretty far upriver from the ocean, mangrove forests, seagrass beds. The really scary thing, lionfish have been found by mini submarines as deep as 1,000 feet. So we're going to come back to that. That's an important point to keep in the back of your mind. One of the things that I found in my research is that lionfish are strongly associated with human-made habitats. Things like dock pilings, bridges, jetties, seawalls, even artificial reefs. And this applies in urban, developed habitats, but it also applies in very natural, pristine systems. Sometimes when I'm out diving on a beautiful, healthy coral reef, I'll come across one car tire or one chunk of a broken boat, and there's 5 lionfish sitting on it. So they seem to like disturbed habitats. Here's a video. I want you to try to take a look and figure out what these lionfish are hanging out on. There's 7 big lionfish hanging out on this one piece of structure. I think I heard an answer. What is it? Not an anchor. It's a chair. Yeah, it's a patio chair under a dock. You could swim 100 feet in either direction and not see a single lionfish, but on this one patio chair, you've got a bunch of lionfish. So another really important observation that I've made in my work is that lionfish can survive in extremely low salinity habitats. And this is not expected because remember, in the wild, lionfish from the Pacific are typically found on coral reefs. They're not an estuarine fish. They're not a fish that you would find in river mouths or brackish areas. So what I found is that in the wild, lionfish can handle an extremely broad salinity range, and they can also handle really rapid fluctuations in salinity. How many of you have kept saltwater fish tanks? Okay, decent number. The golden rule, as those of you who've kept saltwater tanks know, the golden rule to keeping a successful fish tank is acclimating your fish to the salinity of your tank when you bring them home. So when you buy a new fish at the pet store, you bring it home and you drip water in from your fish tank slowly to get the 2 salinities equal. Lionfish don't need that. In estuarine systems, when you have a lot of fresh water coming downriver from a rain event, salinities get very low around low tide, and then as the tide pushes back in, they go back up. And what I found is that lionfish can handle fluctuations of up to 30 parts per thousand in a 6-hour tide window. Just as a reminder, the ocean is 35 parts per thousand. So that's almost like going from pure freshwater to pure saltwater in 6 hours every day, and that doesn't kill them. In the wild, they can handle brief exposure to salinities of 1 part per thousand. That's so fresh, if you take your snorkel out of your mouth, you can't taste salt. They can't handle that for a long time, but as long as that low tide salinity doesn't go below 1 and then rises back up as the tide comes back in, these fish can survive. And they were even present in the Loxahatchee estuary, a little bit south of here, immediately following tropical storm events when there's a ton of fresh water coming downriver. So this is the furthest upriver sighting of a lionfish that I've made so far, and that's not photoshopped. It's a little bright with this projector, but the water is really that orange. That shows that it's fresh water coming out of the upper estuary. It's tannic, it's brown, it's influenced more by upstream effects rather than the ocean. This fish was 4.1 miles upriver, living on an oyster reef. The salinity at the very bottom was about 8 parts per thousand, so that's very low brackish water. But if you came up more than 6 or 8 inches off the bottom, it was completely fresh. Because salt water is a little denser than fresh water, we often get a layer of salty water at the very bottom. That fish was completely content to live in a 6-inch or 8-inch thick layer of slightly brackish water below a layer of pure fresh water. So here are some fish immediately after Tropical Storm Isaac. Lionfish in the wild don't typically struggle and fight against currents, but in the invaded range, they have no trouble dealing with these unusual environmental perturbations. These fish are A-OK in this very low salinity brackish water following a tropical storm. So to try to get a better understanding of how lionfish are able to cope with low salinities, I conducted a study in the laboratory where I exposed lionfish that I collected here in Florida to really low salinities. So I brought them down to about 7 parts per thousand, which again is really low brackish water, and I held them there for a month. And believe it or not, after a month, remember this is a coral reef fish, after a month, the fish that were held at that low salinity showed no difference in diet, no difference in behavior, and absolutely no mortality. They were able to live for an entire month at a really low salinity. So then I lowered salinities even a little bit more to try to figure out what their baseline minimum salinity tolerance was. And it turns out that every lionfish I tested could survive down to 5 parts per thousand. And some individuals could survive at 4 parts per thousand for up to 94 hours. 4 parts per thousand is just barely salty. That's so fresh that most freshwater fish could survive in 4 parts per thousand for a little bit without any problems. So this ability to survive in low salinities has some pretty major ecological implications. One, it means that lionfish may be able to colonize estuaries throughout the invaded range. So throughout the Atlantic and the Caribbean islands, Central America, these lionfish may be going up into estuaries. And the problem is, scientists aren't looking at estuaries. Recreational divers don't go diving in estuaries. So there may be large populations of lionfish existing in estuaries that we don't know about. The other problem, you remember when I showed you the map, I said lionfish haven't crossed the mouth of the Orinoco rivers yet, Orinoco and Amazon rivers. Because of this ability to survive in very low salinities, combined with the fact that oftentimes there's a little bit of a slightly saltier layer down in the bottom of the ocean, I think it's really likely that in time, lionfish may get across the Amazon and Orinoco discharge plumes and colonize several thousand miles of the coast of Brazil. Pretty scary. Now the good news is the surface waters in that area are fresh, and we don't think that the little baby drifting lionfish will be able to get through that freshwater barrier, but adult lionfish may be able to slowly move through that plume. So in addition to being very physiologically durable, meaning they can handle salinity fluctuations, they can handle temperature extremes, lionfish are also very physically durable. This is a picture that we took in the Bahamas of a lionfish that has no tail. But it wasn't a fresh injury. It was completely healed. The fish was acting normal. It was swimming fairly normally. And when we cut it open, its belly was full of food. That fish was still able to feed even without a tail. We've had some lionfish. I work with an aquarium down in Jupiter, the River Center on the Loxahatchee. They had a lionfish that was donated to them that somebody had speared. The spear went completely through its body, left a dime-sized hole. That fish eventually healed and lived for years. It was able to survive a through-and-through spear shot right through its body. So they're extremely durable fish. Lionfish, unfortunately, eat anything they can fit in their mouths. Literally. There have been studies done throughout the Caribbean and the Bahamas and the Western Atlantic that have documented dozens and dozens and dozens of our native fish and invertebrates in lionfish diets. The larger lionfish tend to eat mostly small fishes. The smaller lionfish eat a lot of crabs and shrimp. One of the scary things I found is that lionfish are constantly feeding. So a variety of different feeding studies have been conducted, and on average, lionfish are eating 1 to 2 fish per hour. And out of all the lionfish that I've personally sampled, 93% of them contain food in their stomach. So by a show of hands, how many of you have had dinner already tonight? All right, so a little more than half. There was a major fish study done years ago that looked all around the globe at how often predatory fish are empty. And what they found was that on average, 50% of the time, predatory fish are completely empty. They don't eat all the time. They eat, and then they digest, and then they eat some more, and then they digest some more. So the fact that lionfish had food in their stomach 93% of the time tells us that they're doing something differently than most other predatory fish. They're constantly feeding. So why? Why were lionfish such successful predators? So I have another little video. Watch this lionfish as he swims around. Our native prey, our little fish, don't recognize lionfish as a threat. Watch right here. A school of little fish are going to swim by this lionfish, oblivious to the fact that he's a predator. They have a unique feeding strategy. They spread their pectoral fins really wide, and they corral their prey into a corner, and then they use a vacuum cleaner type mouth to slurp their dinner in. So this feeding strategy, combined with the fact that lionfish aren't recognized by prey as a predator, has allowed them to become very successful feeders. In fact, our native prey, when you watch lionfish interact with native fish, will sometimes hide under a lionfish because, in my mind, they look like a ball of algae or a ball of seaweed. So our fish just don't understand that lionfish are a threat. However, if you look at a native predator, when that native predator swims through a school of prey, they give it a wide margin. I call this the halo. Whenever you see a predator swimming through a school of prey, the prey fish know to stay back. Whether it's a snook with some small snapper or a Nassau grouper with grunts around it, again, you can see these grunts are giving the grouper a margin of error, a little bit of space. Little schoolmaster snapper, again, the grunts are forming a halo around this fish. What do you think is going to happen when we look at a lionfish with some prey around it? Completely and absolutely oblivious to the fact that that lionfish could eat it. And if you remember a few slides ago, there was a pretty large prey fish laying next to that lionfish. Lionfish are able to eat food half their body length. I've had fish in the lab that I've fed really large prey fish to, and they'll swim around with that fish's tail hanging out of their mouth for an hour as they work it in. They have no problem gobbling food down. As long as they can fit it in their mouth, they'll eat it. So one of my colleagues did a really unique study to look at how our native prey fish respond to the presence of a lionfish. So what she did is she set up a cage. And in that cage, she put a divider. So there's a divider here. And on one side, she put a small native predator, a little grouper, about the size of a lionfish. And then on the other side, she put some native prey fish. And you'll notice, other than these goofballs, all of our native prey are staying as far away from that native grouper as possible. She repeated it with a lionfish, and no surprise, all of the native prey are oblivious to the fact that that lionfish could be a threat. They are swimming freely throughout their half of the cage. She has since gone to the Pacific Ocean, repeated this experiment using lionfish from the Pacific as well as prey from the Pacific, and in that circumstance, the prey fish act exactly like they do when an Atlantic grouper is present. They stay as far away from the lionfish as possible. So that tells us that when prey fish evolve in the presence of lionfish in the Pacific, those prey fish know to keep away. They know it's a predator. Here in the Atlantic, because our little prey fish have not evolved with lionfish being in their ecosystem, they don't know to avoid lionfish. So another study done very recently looked at the effects of lionfish on two small gobies, fish that you might see out on the coral reef. And what they found was when a small Nassau grouper approached these gobies, the gobies became still. They kind of hunkered down a little bit. They moved around a little bit less. They had a definite response to the presence of a small Nassau grouper. As I'm sure you're going to guess, when a lionfish approached the gobies continued to act completely normally. They did not perceive that lionfish as a threat. In another study, damselfish aggression was assessed. How many of you have ever been attacked by a damselfish when you're scuba diving? These are an extremely territorial little coral reef fish. They're very pretty, but they maintain a pretty strong dominance on the reef in terms of holding a territory. If you're scuba diving and you get too close and you try to take pictures of a damselfish, they'll often come out and peck the camera. They'll peck your face. They'll bite you. So in this particular study, they looked at the response of this real pretty three-spot damselfish to native predators as well as lionfish. When native predators approached the territory of a three-spot damselfish, they got attacked. The damselfish pecked them. Even if they were bigger fish that could have eaten the damselfish. They don't like other fish entering their territory, and they're very aggressive about showing it. When a lionfish approaches a three-spot damselfish, the damselfish doesn't react at all. There's no reaction. However, that's the story of prey. There's also a story of predators. What are our native predators doing to lionfish? Why aren't our grouper and our sharks and barracudas devouring lionfish? So just like our native prey, our native predators are completely naive about lionfish. Because lionfish didn't evolve here, the big grouper and snapper and barracuda and eels, they didn't have an evolutionary history with this particular prey item, so they don't know that it's a prey item. In addition to a lack of evolutionary history with predators and prey, there's also no evolutionary history with parasites. We don't find a whole lot of parasites on lionfish, and compared to our native fish, lionfish are relatively parasite and disease-free. So there have been a few examples of native predators eating lionfish. It can be done. In fact, any fish that eats their prey head first, that allows this venomous spines to fold down, they, in theory, could eat lionfish. However, it's only been documented in a few examples with grouper. There was a really unique study done by James Morris at NOAA looking at how a small grouper, a black sea bass, responded to two different types of prey items, both very spiky. One was a pinfish. So anyone who's gone fishing with pinfish knows they're called pinfish for a reason. They have a real spiny dorsal fin. And the other, obviously, was lionfish. So he set up a large tank, and in that tank, he put two clear acrylic tubes. In one tube, he put a pinfish. In another tube, he put a lionfish, and then he introduced a very hungry black sea bass that had been starved for a few days. What happened was the black sea bass raced over to the pinfish tube and stared at it. In some cases, it got so aggressive it knocked the tube over and ate the pinfish. In almost no circumstances did the black sea bass investigate the lionfish tube. After a little while, he lifted both of those tubes up and allowed the lionfish and the pinfish to swim around. In every single case, the black sea bass ate the spiny pinfish. The sea bass would chase the pinfish, and it would run around and around and around, and eventually the black sea bass would eat the pinfish. In only one or maybe two cases did the lionfish try to eat, or I'm sorry, did the black sea bass try to eat the lionfish. In almost all the other cases, the hungry sea bass completely ignored the lionfish. And there's an interesting story here. It's not because the lionfish is venomous. It's because of the way the lionfish acts. Lionfish are incredibly bold fish. They know they're venomous. They know they're a tough guy. So when a predator like a black sea bass or a grouper or a shark approaches a lionfish, or even a diver, lionfish don't run away. So when a predator sees food that it's used to seeing run away, suddenly hold its ground and not run away, they seem to lose interest. They don't have a feeding instinct for fish that hold their ground. And I could probably say the same for most of you. If I gave you an ice cream cone or a hamburger and it ran away, you probably wouldn't want to eat it. Well, lionfish are acting the same way towards their predators. Lionfish hold their ground, they don't move, and that's not a normal response for a prey item. We have seen a few cases of big moray eels eating lionfish. I've observed it, and a few other scientists throughout the area have observed it, but there's one common denominator. Every single time we've seen a lionfish get eaten by a moray eel, the lionfish has been injured. It was either speared or in some other way damaged, and it was fleeing. It was running away. It was doing exactly the opposite of what they did in that previous experiment. So when a lionfish runs away, that triggers a dinner bell response in a moray eel, and there have been some examples where morays ate lionfish. Now this is a really cool picture that somebody sent me from the Keys. Here's a cormorant eating a lionfish. And not just one, but actually the woman who took this photo said that this particular cormorant, in the course of a half an hour, caught and swallowed 2 lionfish. So this is important. Fish aren't good parents. Most marine fish never see their offspring, and they certainly don't teach their offspring what to eat. However, birds spend a lot of time raising their babies. So maybe if cormorants start liking lionfish, they find them easy to catch because they don't run away, mother cormorant might be able to teach this to her offspring, and we might end up with cormorants helping control lionfish. We'll keep our fingers crossed on that one. So there was an interesting study done in the Cayman Islands looking at how wild predators react to lionfish. And what they did is they tethered live lionfish to the reef. And tethering is exactly what it sounds like. You take a little piece of monofilament, you tie it to the lionfish, and then you hook it to a dive weight. And you drop that on the reef. And what they found was that in some cases, wild predators would eat tethered lionfish. So they were excited. They were trying to demonstrate that there are predators out there that will eat lionfish. However, there's a big flaw in this study. There are certain areas in the Cayman Islands where it's very popular for people to spearfish lionfish and then hand feed them to groupers and snapper and sharks. When they did this study, they put lionfish on seagrass beds, they put them on coral reefs where there wasn't any spearfishing, and they put them on coral reefs where there was spearfishing. Lionfish weren't consumed on seagrass beds. Lionfish weren't consumed on coral reefs where there was no spearfishing. They were only consumed on coral reefs where people actively were spearfishing them and then hand-feeding the predators. So maybe you're thinking, did the predators learn to eat lionfish after being hand-fed? Yes and no. These fish are practically tame. They would eat your glove if you offered it to them. So they're used to handouts. And I think that a tethered lionfish is probably not acting exactly like a wild lionfish. They're acting a little weird. So I think these predators that are used to eating handouts, they know that a dead lionfish is tasty. They see a lionfish that's tied to the bottom and can't act normally. I think they're feeding on them. And the real telling sign was one of the predators that was eating lionfish in this particular scientific study was a nurse shark. Not exactly the predator that you'd think of chasing down and eating a fish. So I think this study tells us that fish can eat lionfish, but it doesn't tell us that wild fish are actively eating lionfish. So as a result of having naive prey, food that doesn't run away from you, having naive predators, predators that don't chase you down, lionfish focus a lot of their energy to growth. And in fact, They grow really rapidly. I conducted a tagging study where I put tags in lionfish and then came back a few months later and recaptured them. And what I found was that on average, lionfish were growing around a half an inch per month, which is really rapid for fish. Some individuals, though, the faster growing individuals in the population, were growing almost 1 inch every month. This rapid growth presents a big problem. Remember earlier I said smaller lionfish eat mostly crabs and invertebrates, shrimp, small things. Bigger lionfish eat fish. So obviously faster growth allows for lionfish to eat more food, eat bigger prey items, eat more important prey items like fish, and it allows them to mature earlier and start reproducing. We call this enemy release. You free up a lionfish from its enemies, whether those enemies are predatory groupers and snappers or an enemy as small as a virus. If you free up a lionfish from its predators, it allows it to do something pretty phenomenal, and that is grow gigantic. The largest lionfish, that's 19 inches, the largest lionfish caught in the Atlantic are substantially bigger than the largest that have ever been seen in their native range. They're much bigger. On average, talking to people that have spent a lot of time diving in the Pacific Ocean, this particular species of lionfish in the Pacific, a big one might be 11, 12 inches would be a really big one. So they're getting to 19 inches here, routinely 16, 17, 18 inches. They're getting much, much bigger. And again, being bigger, they can produce more eggs and they can eat more food. So there was several studies that were conducted very recently looking at how native predators might be affecting lionfish without any tethering. So the way they did this is they did surveys on 71 different reefs throughout the invaded range. And they looked at two things. They looked at the number of predators, and they looked at the number of lionfish. And what they said was that if predators were controlling lionfish in the wild, areas that had lots of predators would have very few lionfish. And conversely, areas that had lots of lionfish would have very few predators. Unfortunately, across the entire Caribbean basin, they did not find that. There was no relationship between how many predators were around and how many lionfish were around. So that suggests that right now, predators are not controlling lionfish. Now, I'm optimistic that in time, predators are going to learn that lionfish are completely edible. They're going to start to feed on lionfish. The million-dollar question is, how soon is that going to happen? Is it going to be 5 years from now, or is it going to be 50 years from now? We just don't know. Now, one of the things that I'm hoping is that little tiny lionfish, these fish are little, these fish are around an inch long, a little over an inch long, little tiny lionfish will start to become a food item for little snapper and juvenile groupers on the reef, real abundant small fish on the reef. Reason being, small lionfish aren't very hard to eat. There's no real strong defensive system. They have spines, just like the larger lionfish, but they're not very strong yet. They haven't developed very much. So moving on, lionfish have some really bizarre behaviors that make them good invaders. And one of the most unique behaviors they have is a propensity to actually blow jets of water out of their mouth at their dinner. And what that does is it disorients their prey, and since little fish like to face into the current, it'll get their prey to turn and face the lionfish, and then the lionfish uses that vacuum cleaner of a mouth to slurp them up head first. So in this picture, they're releasing some dye into the water in front of this lionfish, and you can see the dye is actually shooting out at this little tiny goby. So the other unusual behavior that lionfish possess, like I mentioned earlier, they're extremely, extremely bold. They absolutely, positively hold their ground to the point that if you're diving, you can poke it right between the eyes and it won't swim away. They're amazingly bold fish. They do not flee. And they've got these incredible venomous spines. When I give these talks, people always ask me, how bad does this lionfish sting hurt? Normally it's not too bad. The way the spine works is remarkable. If you look at the spines on a fish's back, normally, if you were to cut them in cross-section, they're round like a tree trunk. Lionfish, though, if you can see in this diagram, lionfish have a spine that looks like a three-leafed clover in cross-section. Running down the length of the spine are 3 grooves. In those grooves are the glandular venom-producing tissue that causes pain when you get stung. So when you get zapped by a lionfish, there's a pretty complicated injection process going on. The outside of each spine is covered by a real thin membrane of tissue. That membrane, when you get punctured, that membrane pushes down very much like pushing a sock down. It gets crumpled up. And if you look at this lionfish, you can see the white spine showing as this brown membrane has gotten pushed down. When that membrane pushes down, it ruptures all those venom glands. At the same time, the crumpling creates pressure. I think of it like an inside-out syringe. So that crumpling causes pressure, ruptures venom glands, and causes the venom to rush up into those grooves. And I learned the hard way that not all stings are equal. The last sting I got caused my hand to blow up like a balloon. You can see on this hand tendons and vessels. On this hand, you can't. My hand stayed swollen for over a week and hurt for about a month. That said, I've been stung by our native scorpion fish, like I showed you in the earlier part of the talk. It feels about the same. There's not a real big difference. Some people have major reactions to lionfish, including swelling like this. Most people, though, would describe the sting more like a bad wasp sting. Certainly not pleasant, but nothing that's going to send you to the ER. We always worry about people having an allergic reaction to the sting, but so far from what I've heard, there haven't been any documented lionfish allergies. Nobody's died from a lionfish. Generally, it's unpleasant. The best remedy for it is to run your hand under hot water. The neurotoxic venom that comes out of those grooves on the side of the spines is sensitive to heat. Now, you don't want to burn yourself, but if you can cover your hand or your elbow or your arm, or wherever you happen to get stung, with hot water, like hot tap water, it'll make the pain go away. Now, what if you're out diving on a boat? Where would you get hot water if you didn't bring any with you? Does anybody know? The engine, the water jet coming out of the side of your outboard is hot enough that if you can scoop some of that up into a cup or a bucket and treat the sting, it'll make it feel better. Now, when this happened to me, since then I've been careful. I haven't been stung by a lionfish since. I'm much more cautious because I'm afraid that maybe I'm developing a sensitivity. I've been stung at least 50 times. So I've had a lot of lionfish stings, and I was a little careless initially, and now I'm much more cautious. But my boss at the time, he kind of laughed at me, and then he got stung, and his hand blew up like a balloon also. So I felt a little better after he got zapped. I don't think his wedding ring came off for a week. So here's another video. I want you to watch closely. Right in here, watch what this lionfish does. Boom, boom. They're actually able to use their back muscles to jab. Watch again. They're able to use those back muscles to jab those venomous spines out just a little bit. They're not aggressive. Remember I said they hold their ground? The issue here is if you're reaching into a cave to grab a lobster and your arm gets a little bit too close, they are able to actively jab those spines into you, and that's how they deliver their venom. So right now, the big question is, what are lionfish doing? What effect are they having on our native reefs, our native ecosystems? What are the consequences of this invasion that we've been hearing about nonstop for the last few years? The problem is there haven't been a lot of very good scientific studies looking at this yet. There have only been a handful, in fact. Most of them, though, are pretty troubling. The first study that came out looking at the effects of lionfish on other native fish showed that lionfish were having a pretty big impact. So these graphs are really simple. On the x-axis going across is just the number of weeks that the study was run for. So this particular study was run for 5 weeks. And on the y-axis is the number of little fish that show up at the study site. These study sites were very small patch reefs, only literally as big as my arms right now, little tiny patch reefs in a big sandy area. So what the scientist did is he divided the reefs in half. On half of the patch reefs, he put a lionfish. On the other half, he didn't. He didn't fence them in or anything, but because these little patches were in the middle of a sandy area, the lionfish didn't move around a lot. They stayed put. What he found was that after 5 weeks, this black bar represents the number of little fish that were present on reefs where there were no lionfish. You can see there were quite a few little fish present. The scary thing is after 5 weeks, when you have one lionfish present on these small reefs, there's an 80% reduction in the amount of little fish present on those reef sites. The problem with that study, the reason I have an asterisk next to it, is it was conducted on a very small scale. These reefs are that big. As you know, most coral reefs aren't the size of a desk. They're big. So this study shows us that lionfish are capable of removing a lot of small fish from the reef. It doesn't show us what's happening on a natural reef system. However, this next study conducted by Stephanie Green tends to show that lionfish might be having an effect on bigger reef areas. So this study, instead of studying little patch reefs, studied an area several miles long in the Bahamas. And what she found was that for small fish that are known to be lionfish prey, there was a 65% reduction in biomass over earlier studies. That sounds really scary. There is a little problem with this study as well, though. In this column, these are fish that had no interactions with lionfish. They're large-bodied fish. They weren't lionfish prey. They weren't lionfish competitors. They were pretty much just living their life oblivious to lionfish. And one of the problems here is that even though these fish are not interacting with lionfish, as you can see, their numbers have gone below the baseline as well. So obviously, there's some other process going on that's causing reef fish in this area to decline. Maybe not the full 65% of the decline, but some percentage of this decline is likely due to other factors that maybe we have something to do with. This study, though, gets really scary. Again, lots of lines, lots of colors. Don't get overwhelmed. It's exactly like the last graph. This is the number of weeks the study was run. So it was run for 8 weeks. And this is essentially the number of little fish that are present on those same small patch reefs. Except this time, instead of just putting out a lionfish, the researcher put out either a lionfish or a small grouper called a coney. We don't have a whole lot of conies in Florida, but we have rock hind and red hind, Graysby. Those are the little speckled grouper that you see when you're lobstering up under caves and ledges. So again, the black line represents control reefs where there were no predators. And as you can see, after 8 weeks, there were a lot of little fish there. Now, when you introduce this native grouper, there is a decline. Obviously, if you put a native grouper on a reef, the grouper is going to eat dinner, and that feeding is going to reduce the amount of little fish that are present. Here's where it gets scary. When you introduce a lionfish, the effect of the lionfish is 2.5 times greater than the effects of a similar-sized native predator. So what this tells us is, all things being equal, invasive lionfish are 2.5 times more capable of capturing and eating native prey than the small native predator is. Now, all of these studies that I just talked to you about involve fish as prey. So one of the things that I wanted to look at is, what are little lionfish doing to those crabs and shrimp that they specialize on? So last year we conducted a study where we set up a bunch of cages, and in those cages we put some substrate and we put a lionfish. And what we found was that after a few weeks, the lionfish was able to depress the density and biomass of little crabs and shrimp in those cages compared to cages that didn't have a lionfish. So not only are they able to effectively consume our native fish prey, they're also eating little crabs and shrimp. Little crabs and shrimp are really important because they make up the bottom of the food web. Those little crabs and shrimp are what our little snapper and grouper feed on. Now, we had one really interesting observation during this study. When you put a lionfish in a cage, it eats lots of little crabs and lots of shrimp. There's less crabs, there's less shrimp, but there's more variety of crabs and shrimp. You actually get higher biological richness when the lionfish is present. We had to think about this for a little while, and what we came up with is that lionfish are probably eating some of the medium-sized predators out of these cages. Some little gobies, maybe some big crabs that are predatory crabs. So by getting rid of some of those predators as they feed, it might allow other rare species to come into the cage and not get gobbled up by those medium-sized predators. So what are the threats? What are these fish going to do to our coral reefs, our coastal systems, our estuaries? Well, there's two main concerns we have. One is that as predators, lionfish are going to start eating things we care about. They're going to start eating juvenile stone crabs and juvenile grouper, juvenile snapper. And in fact, when I cut lionfish open and look at their stomach contents, it's not that uncommon to find small snapper in their stomachs. And if you look at all the literature that's been conducted throughout the invaded area, grouper and snapper definitely show up in the stomachs of lionfish as food. The other thing we're concerned about is lionfish competing with our native predators. Remember, I showed you that the lionfish is 2.5 times better, so to speak, at catching prey fish. Well, if the lionfish is head-to-head against a little mangrove snapper or a little gag grouper, fish that we like, that lionfish is probably going to be a lot better able to get dinner, and it might leave our native predators hungry. But the truth is, we really don't know yet. The 4 studies that I just showed you looking at the effects of lionfish on prey are the only studies that have been done so far. So we need more scientific research to find out really how bad this invasion is and what effects these lionfish are having on our native communities. So the reason I'm here tonight is to talk about some of these upcoming lionfish eradication efforts, particularly the one coming up next month in Martin County. Do these structured lionfish eradication events, the rodeos, the derbies, the safaris, do they matter? Are they making a difference? Is there anything that we can do to help control this invasion? This was a derby that we ran in Abaco in the Bahamas. In one day, we removed, I think, 2,700 lionfish. Unfortunately, they come back. But there's some good news. In order to look at how we might be able to control the invasion, we first have to figure out what lionfish do. How do they move around? How do they spend their time? What space do they use? So in order to figure out how lionfish moved around, I conducted a tagging study, a mark and recapture study. And the purpose here was to look at site fidelity in lionfish. Do they stick around one area or do they move around a whole lot? How do they move? When do they move? And then also, how do they grow? And this is really important because it's going to help us understand how the invasion is progressing and also how we might be able to control the invasion. What I found was pretty remarkable. During the course of the study, I tagged 55 lionfish. And of those, I was able to recapture 44 at least one time. That's an 80% recapture rate. So I'm sure many of you are aware that Florida Fish and Wildlife tags a lot of fish. And one of their big programs here on the East Coast is a snook tagging program. They put little plastic tags into the dorsal fin of snook. And on average, if they get a 1 or 2% recapture rate, they're pretty happy. If you get a 5% recapture rate, you're ecstatic. So the fact that I got an 80% recapture rate tells us something. And I'm not talking about a few days or a few weeks. Most of these fish were at liberty for at least 4 months between recaptures. Sometimes I was able to catch an individual fish up to 5 different times during the course of the study. And what I found was that most of the fish stayed in the exact same spot. Many of them stayed in place for up to 4 months. Most of the fish, 75% of them, moved less than 30 feet. So they're really staying put, using an area the size of the stage for their day-to-day movements. The fish that were out the longest, I had 2 individuals that were out for about 7 months. They only moved 200 feet. So that's not a real substantial movement. So this high site fidelity that I documented by tagging fish and then trying to recapture them tells us that we might be able to control lionfish populations on a local scale. So what I mean is that if you go into a local area, a patch reef, an artificial wreck, an area of reef that a lot of people frequent maybe, and you are able to eradicate all the lionfish that you see, new adult lionfish aren't going to swim over to refill that spot. Remember, they don't move around a lot, so it's not like they're going to recolonize that area. That area is only going to get recolonized by little tiny lionfish that are drifting in from the ocean. So if we can go out and try to eradicate lionfish regularly, we might be able to control the population. However, we're talking about control, all right? We're not talking about eradication. And there's a big reason for that. We'll talk about it in a second. Are these control efforts having any effect? So I said that movements suggest that lionfish might be able to be controlled locally. There's not a lot of research telling us whether this is the case or not. But fortunately, there have been a few small studies that suggest that our efforts to control lionfish are a worthwhile cause. So first, there was a study conducted in the Cayman Islands where they looked at sites where lionfish had been heavily eradicated versus sites where lionfish had not been eradicated. And what they found was that there was a 10-fold decrease in lionfish densities at sites where eradication efforts have been conducted. And they found that those densities stayed low for up to 70 days. So what that tells us is as long as you go out and do your eradications at least every other month, in theory, you can control lionfish populations. But the important point is that lionfish at the sites where these removals occurred were smaller. So remember, smaller lionfish have a smaller ecological impact. They eat less food. The type of food they eat is different. What kind of food do they eat? Shrimp and crabs, yeah. So they're eating things that are a little bit less valuable to us. Still valuable from a food chain perspective, but less economically valuable. And then finally, these smaller lionfish at the removal sites, they reproduce less. So in the Caymans, steady reduction of lionfish populations are having a positive effect. In Bonaire and Curacao, they saw similar patterns. There was a number of sites in Bonaire and Curacao where eradications had been conducted. Those sites had a 3- to 4-fold reduction in lionfish populations versus sites where no eradication efforts had been conducted. So this is showing us that, again, continuous, steady eradication of lionfish on certain habitats may be able to keep their populations under control. And then finally, this is not an official study, but there's been some evidence coming from Jamaica that since the government started a lionfish eradication program, there's been a 66% reduction in lionfish sightings on reefs. So our efforts are having an effect. But the problem is, at this point, like I said a second ago, we're not talking about eradication. We're only talking about control. And the reason that we're only talking about control is lionfish have this deep water refuge. Remember I said lionfish are found really deep? If there are lionfish down at 500 and 1,000 feet reproducing, no matter how many lionfish we kill down to the recreational dive limits, 140 feet, there are always going to be new eggs and new larvae drifting up. However, those new eggs and new larvae are going to turn into little tiny lionfish, and as long as we're able to keep those big lionfish off of our reefs, there's going to be a smaller ecological impact. So what I advocate is focusing lionfish removal efforts on ecologically and economically important habitats, nursery habitats, estuaries where little fish grow up, coral reefs where dive operators take tours to, places that have value for us. So if you're going to focus a limited amount of effort on removing lionfish, focus those efforts on areas that have the highest ecological and economic value. So there's one really unexpected result that's come about from all of these eradication efforts. As we started handling lionfish more and more, we noticed that they're pretty darn smart fish. I've actually done a lot of research on fish that are typically considered bright fish. I work with tarpon, I work with bonefish, permit. These are fish that are held in really high esteem by anglers, but I won't hesitate to say that lionfish are by far and away the smartest fish I've ever studied. When you take a lionfish and you visit it for the first time, they're bold, they hold their ground like we said earlier. When you mess with the lionfish once, their behavior changes forever. They remember a negative interaction and they become a very different fish. So when I was tagging lionfish, when I netted those fish, I very quickly took them up into the boat, put a tag into them, and I released them. The next time I saw those fish, even if it was 4 or 5 months later, they were a different beast. Instead of having those fins out and instead of holding their ground and being bold, they were cryptic. Their fins were tucked in, they were kind of making themselves small. As you approached them, they would swim away. So just one negative interaction is enough to make a lionfish start to act shy. So in a study that my advisor was a co-author on, they looked at lionfish in a variety of different areas that had eradication efforts and areas that had not received any eradication efforts. And what they found is that in areas that had received heavy lionfish harvest pressure, lionfish were starting to act more shy. They were hiding more. They were less active in the middle of the day. They were more active in the evening. They were up under ledges and caves. So one of two things is happening here. Either we are killing all the brave, bold lionfish, and all that are left behind are the ones that are naturally shy, or through our efforts to kill them, maybe we miss a few. You know, every once in a while you miss a few, right? We've got some lionfish slayers in the audience today. When you miss a lionfish with a spear, that lionfish learns its lesson pretty quickly, and their behavior changes. So one of the cautionary tales of this story was that if lionfish become more shy, those shy lionfish are going to reproduce more and make our entire population harder to find and harder to kill. But there's a plus side to that. A shy lionfish isn't out eating all day long. A shy lionfish is not going to have a full stomach 93% of the time. A shy lionfish is probably going to have a smaller ecological impact just because of that shyness. And in fact, I think what's happening is our efforts to remove lionfish are actually making lionfish act like they do in the Pacific. In the Pacific, lionfish are shy. In areas where humans have tried to eradicate lionfish, they're becoming similarly shy. So the moral here is it's really important if you're doing lionfish hunts or eradications or derbies to try to find those hidden lionfish. Don't just shoot the obvious ones. Try to remove the fish that are hidden so we can take those shy fish out of the gene pool. All right, so what about harvesting lionfish as a food source? Why don't we just go out, kill every lionfish, bring them back to market, sell them for a bunch of money? I mean, obviously, we've pushed a lot of other fish stocks into oblivion. Why don't we do it with lionfish? Well, there are a lot of efforts to move in that direction, but there are a few problems. 2 years ago, there was a lobsterman in the Florida Keys who caught 18,000 lionfish in his lobster traps, just one lobsterman. And because of that, he was able to start selling lionfish, and there's other people that have moved in that direction, and in fact, there's some fisheries developing throughout the Caribbean, and lionfish right now is selling for a fortune. It wholesales for $10 a pound in the whole, head on, guts in. If you think about it, a lionfish's fillet is about 1/3 of its body weight. So that's $30 a pound. There's a few fish markets that are selling it locally, which is great. But the problem is, because it's expensive and because it's hard to capture, we're having a hard time developing a stable market. It's more of a specialty item rather than a regular menu item. And the issue is that in order to catch lionfish, you have to dive down and spear them. Or if you're a lobster fisherman, you can incidentally catch them in lobster traps. You don't get them hook and line very often. You don't catch them netting. They're primarily targeted by spear fishermen, and throughout the Caribbean, most of the fisheries are not spear-based fisheries. So it's difficult to develop a spear-based fishery in an area where one doesn't exist in order to sustain this market. There's another issue. There was a paper that came out that said lionfish can have ciguatera. How many of you are familiar with the word ciguatera? All right, a lot of people. Ciguatera, for those of you who aren't, ciguatera is a neurotoxin that you can get from eating certain kinds of fish. Causes a pretty major illness, a nerve-related illness. Generally, it's found in large coral reef fish, big barracudas, big groupers. And it is a toxin that is bioaccumulated. What that means is that the toxicity accumulates in the tissue of organisms over time, and small fish have a little bit, medium-sized fish have a little bit more. By the time you get to big fish that have eaten lots of those medium-sized fish, it accumulates in their tissues to the point that they become toxic. So because lionfish eat a lot more than other fish, it makes sense that small lionfish are becoming toxic, just like bigger grouper and bigger barracudas. Here's the catch. The only places that lionfish have been documented to have ciguatera are areas that already have major ciguatera problems with other fish. So there are islands in the Caribbean that nobody would eat a barracuda, nobody would eat a big black grouper or a big Warsaw grouper. In those areas, you shouldn't eat lionfish. But there have never been documented cases of ciguatera in the United States, with the exception of travelers who caught it while they were traveling in the Caribbean and then brought it home. So in Florida, we don't have to worry about spearing lionfish that have ciguatera, just like we don't have to worry about grouper or snapper that have ciguatera. Finally, there's one other unusual issue. When you put a price tag on an invasive species, there are business people that will want to take advantage of that. And we've heard reports of commercial divers who are trying to harvest lionfish for the wholesale fish market, passing over little lionfish to let them grow up. So we have an unintended consequence of encouraging people to harvest lionfish, but now you're putting a value on the head of large lionfish, so there's an incentive to allow lionfish to grow bigger. Granted, it's better that they're taking some, but ideally, a quality eradication plan would involve removing all lionfish from the reef, not just the biggest lionfish. What about training predators to eat lionfish? I mentioned earlier in the Cayman Islands, there have been a number of efforts to train grouper and snapper and sharks to eat lionfish right out of your hand. Will this work? And unfortunately, the answer is absolutely not. These big predators are so accustomed to eating handouts that they will eat anything you offer them, but they won't then associate the shape of that dead lionfish with a living lionfish that's fluttering and hovering over the reef. In fact, in the Cayman Islands, at one of the popular dive sites, there's a large grouper that likes dead lionfish so much that it'll swim around and find a live lionfish and hover above it, like a German shorthair pointing a pheasant. It will not eat the lionfish until a diver comes over and spears that lionfish. And this has been videoed over and over again. You see the grouper standing there, waiting for someone to come over. As soon as the lionfish is speared, the grouper eats it off the spear. That grouper won't eat a wild, free-swimming lionfish because, again, lionfish just don't act like dinner. That shark right there is happy to eat a dead lionfish. They've never been documented to feed on wild lionfish. The big problem here is hand feeding leads to aggression. So there's actually a pretty strong stand now amongst lionfish researchers and dive operators against hand feeding lionfish to sharks and barracudas and groupers. There have been a few injuries actually resulting from hand-fed fish getting aggressive and biting divers. So we don't recommend that. And then finally, just to wrap up, it's really important to note that this isn't just a lionfish problem. In fact, I don't think the lionfish problem is that big of an issue when we think of some of the other massive issues we're having in the oceans right now. We talked about overfishing. There's things like global warming, ocean acidification, all the marine debris that's floating around out there, coral diseases. These are huge systemic problems that are global on the scale. The value of this lionfish invasion, in my mind, however, is that it's drawn a lot of attention to the other problems that our ocean is having. We're having a talk tonight that's brought in a great audience because of the lionfish problem, but I think most of you are also probably ocean aware. You're aware of these other problems, and unfortunately, the lionfish invasion has made more and more people ocean aware. It's brought a lot of attention to other problems that our ocean is facing. So, in addition to this lionfish, there are 31 other species of Pacific Ocean aquarium fish that have been documented in Florida. None of these are invasive. They're all still considered exotic because they're not reproducing, but they're here. Now, I definitely don't advocate in eliminating the aquarium hobby or controlling the aquarium trade, but one of the values of this lionfish invasion is that it's brought a tremendous amount of publicity up about not releasing your pets. And that applies to coral reef fish just as much as it does pythons and tegus in the Everglades. So the fact that we suddenly have this huge problem that nobody ever envisioned happening has made pet owners much more aware of the issue of releasing pets. And in my opinion, the days of releasing aquarium pets into the ocean is long since past, thanks to this invasion. So we've got one major problem now, but it's made the public so much more aware of the issue of not releasing pets, and then just in general, taking better care of the ocean and working to conserve the resources we have left, and working to try to minimize major global threats to the ocean, the global warming threats, the ocean acidification threats, that could greatly change the oceans as we know them. And with that, I want to just take a second to thank all the people that have helped me during the course of my research, and particularly Martin County and the Loxahatchee River District for funding some of my projects. And I'd be really happy to try to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much.